In this Q&A, I'm going to talk about barking. And I've answered this question a few times on my personal Instagram page, and I wanted to put it up here on my business page, Diligent Canine, so that you guys can have that information as well. And the short answer to barking is to get a dog to stop barking, you teach them to bark. And this sounds a little counterintuitive, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about it from the dog's perspective. That's an important part of dog training, to put yourself in your dog's shoes and try to imagine, given the dog's faculties and senses and prior experiences and training, to imagine where they're at and what's going on. So, the reason teaching a dog to bark helps them to not bark is that it gives them an outlet for that energy. It's important for us as humans to understand that it's perfectly natural for a dog to bark, and it's not fair of us to expect them to never bark. This is true also of chewing or mouthing behaviors. They're not necessarily aggressive, they're not necessarily violent, they're part of a dog's natural instincts and behavior. Every dog chews and sucks when it's whelping, so they all use their mouths to explore and learn about the world. It's not that different for barking. Dogs bark to communicate things. They try to express themselves through barking. So it's important for us to not punish a dog for its natural behavior. What is important is for us to redirect that behavior. In other words, I'm going to teach you when to bark so that you know when it's okay to bark and when it's not okay to bark. It's the same as trying to control any other form of aggression or redirect a behavior that is natural to the dog but you don't particularly find desirable in your domestic environment. Potty training in your house, trying to get the dog to not urinate and defecate in the house, to not chew on the furniture, to not bark at the doorbell, things of that nature. So we need to redirect that bark then, and we teach a dog to bark by finding something that does stimulate it. That might be a squeaky toy, it might be waving a stick around, it might be the doorbell ringing. Believe it or not, this is probably one of the hardest things that I had to find, the thing I had to put the most research into, to finding out what would stimulate my dog enough to make him bark, which is very unusual given that he's a Shepherd Malinois mix. He's pretty quiet for both of those breeds. So it actually took a good bit of trial and error for me to find out what would motivate him to bark, and not just one-off where he something was strange or new, but reliably so that I could start initiating that association of my verbal command, bark, or in German, pass off, alert, with the barking behavior. So, I would give my command, I would introduce the stimulus, whether the squeaker, waving a stick, and when the dog would bark, I would mark and reward that. So, again, this helps control a dog's behavior, whether he's barking at the mailman, at the doorbell, or if you're like sitting outside at Starbucks and your dog barks every time another person walks by, or another dog walks by. You teach them that is not appropriate. You can introduce corrections and things like that after you have taught the dog when it is okay to bark. So where this process goes is that you teach the dog when it's okay to bark, and then the implication there, which is also not implied to the dog, but you have to teach that as well, is when it's not okay to bark. So you're probably going to have a very difficult time if you just try to shut your dog up every time they start to bark. And the dog probably won't understand you getting frustrated and getting angry at the dog not being quiet, and in fact, it might make the dog bark more. Because think about the reasons the dog would bark. If it's afraid, if it's trying to warn you, if it's trying to scare something off, it's trying to tell you something. There's some kind of stimulation or stress in the environment, and you shouting or getting angry about the dog barking is only going to make that worse. So, you need to do your diligence as a dog owner to train the dog when it is okay to bark, because it is okay to bark. It's part of your natural behavior, and I want you to be able to do that. Once that is done, then you also teach the dog when not to bark. So this is similar in process to teaching a dog to sit and lay down. And let's say you have taught it to sit and you give it the sit command and it lays down. That's not what I wanted. You don't get rewarded for that. So when you're practicing this, you teach the dog to bark. And once you've got it to bark reliably, then you can start to introduce a quiet or shh or whatever your stop barking command is. So you can initiate the bark command, and your dog is barking reliably, bark, 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 and then you take away the stimulus, the dog is barking reliably, you give your quiet command, and take away the stimulus, if you're still using one to rile them up and get the bark. And once they're quiet, and not before, but the second they stop barking, you mark and reward. So let's say you're not using the squeaker out of a toy to rile the dog up, and you've gotten far enough in your training where the dog will bark reliably on command. Again, like I just said, you will give the bark command, the dog will bark, and it's bark, 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 bark. Then you say quiet, and wait. You wait as long as you need for the dog to stop barking and realize that that word means something different. As soon as the dog stops barking, you mark and reward it, whatever your choice of reward is or what works best for your dog. So then the dog is learning that it's already learned that bark means make noise with my voice. Quiet means stop making noise with my voice. So I hope that helps. And again, the short answer to teaching your dog to be quiet is to teach them to bark and then teach them to be quiet. So please remember to subscribe on Patreon and help support military working dogs. And as always, remain diligent.